My computer can't run them.
Awesome! We're not finished!
Since the beginning of time when Pong released in 1972, the games industry has sought to create experiences that resemble real life in some manner. Early on, more complicated graphics were developed in an attempt to drive a greater amount of traction to the newly found market. The arcade was the location where such a manner of advertisement was the most prominent, with the most popular games often being those that demonstrated graphical prowess. After all, why would you play Street Fighter when there's Mortal Kombat, Pac-Man when there's Professor Pac-Man, Ninja Clown when there's Guardians of the Hood? More advanced graphical displays also allowed for developers to bring new experiences to life that just wouldn't be possible, or at the very least too enjoyable with the limited technology at the time. Donkey Kong was the first time the world had even heard of Italian men. 2D games continued to become more and more detailed as time would progress, until one game came along and defined the third axis. Battlezone. Fun fact, in addition to being the first 3D game, this game was created using vector graphics, which gave a much cleaner look to all the lines. Fine, Mario 64 was a landmark game, blah blah, it propelled 3D graphics into the mainstream and essentially made it the new standard for games going forward for a period of time, blah blah, who cares, it's just one of the best games ever made. Although games such as Wolfenstein and especially Doom popularized the idea of bringing a third dimension into games, Mario 64 was the first to actually demonstrate the degree to which adding another dimension to games could impact the medium as a whole, with one such impact being, of course, graphics. Immediately, a race began to push for better and better 3D graphics, with visuals quickly becoming more and more realistic. GoldenEye, Far Cry, Ratchet & Clank, Crysis, the Sonic Adventure duology.
I was on a snooze cruise, I guess.
Good thing you're okay.
Video games would push boundaries in graphical technology, with such being a fairly large factor in the growth of the industry as many began to see games as worlds to be immersed in rather than superfluous and pointless experiences as it had been previously. Because tennis is stupid, 3.5 out of 5, but tennis, that's quality, 4.7 out of 5. This has gotten to the point where video games are one of the largest forms of media in the world at the moment, so just like any other STEM major out there, I'm gonna complain about things. Although I do really enjoy seeing the limits of hardware and graphical technology being pushed all the time, I can't help but think, why are we doing it like this? I don't have an inherent problem with seeing every hair on Nathan Drake's head or all the pores in Norman Regis' face, but the more and more these games attempt to replicate real life, the more I feel as though the games industry is beginning to visually homogenize to a certain degree. If you've ever seen a compilation showing off games with conventionally good graphics because you're too poor to actually buy the games, after a bit, it can feel as though you're just watching different clips from the same game. There's often very little beyond lighting and coloration that differentiates these titles visually. It seems that the genre these issues plague the most are first-person shooters. Many of these games stick to an extremely dark color palette so that they can try to look tough as nails, when in reality they're not even tough enough to get past the incubation stage of an infectious disease. The color palette makes it difficult to see anything that's actually going on. Although a drab color palette may indeed convey a certain mood intended by the developers, you are first and foremost making an interactive experience that relies on the capability of the average individual to no-scope everything they can. So why not have the art direction revolve around the point of your game? Save the washed out colors for cutscenes or sections where not having the ability to see as well forces you to think outside of the box and approach the game in a different manner or something. Nuketown is one of the most popular Call of Duty maps, and I really do feel that can be attributed to the fact that it looks so different when looking at nearly every other map throughout the series. There are times where having impressive graphics creates an instance where an actual gameplay is a secondary. Games that attempt to look cinematic fall victim to this problem very often, where things like a fixed frame rate, lens flare, and motion blur seep their way into games because developers want it to look more like a movie. I'm not dumb though, I'm just stupid. I understand that, as had been the case way back in the arcade era, this is done in an effort to elicit a positive response from those who are not as entrenched in video games as those in the target demographic for this video are.
That'll be really good for the upcoming Halo game. That's one of the only reasons I buy an Xbox.
And if you're outside that demographic, well, the YouTube algorithm doesn't make mistakes, so you were meant to be here. You see, when most people see Mario, they say, oh, that's lame, I've seen that on my little brother's lunchbox. But when they see Mario with overalls you can see the threads on, that's when they go, oh. But is this really the case? Are more realistic and high-fidelity graphics really vital to the growth and success of the video game industry? AAA game studios will go out of their way to dump money into their CEOs' pockets, but also into the department handling the visuals of a game, before laying off as much of the staff as possible in order to give the CEO more money. It's gotten to the point that lying about a game's visuals at E3 and other press conferences has become a favored pastime for many of these companies. But then there's Nintendo, a company routinely scolded by the gaming crowd. I'm trying so hard not to say gamers in this video if you couldn't tell, for putting out low-spec consoles. But in spite of being essentially a GameCube with a new skin it got from a CSGO Lotto site, the Wii sold over 101 million units over its lifespan, and the more recent Nintendo Switch sold over 107 million units despite having weak hardware relative to the competition. But these consoles sold well because people wanted to see Mario in space, and also Mario in space again, as well as Mario in space. And not to mention Mario in Space one more time, but it was the one that we already saw in an overpriced bundle. Also Mario and Tennis. Although Nintendo doesn't always put out the most high-fidelity games, the games do exceptionally well because the average consumer understands that a game doesn't have to be super cutting-edge graphically in order to deliver an enjoyable experience. Breath of the Wild assisted in defining the open-world genre, but it did it while being limited to a certain degree by the hardware it runs on. Is it the most impressive-looking game? Definitely not, but it is extremely pleasing to look at. So that begs the question, what is the point in attempting to make super realistic graphics that subtract from the experience that you're having when games with more simplistic graphics have the ability to do just as well, if not better, on the market? How should I know? I feel as though the larger games industry has just fallen into an arms race more than anything, and one that's more dangerous than the one that occurred during the Cold War, considering this time it could leave us with nothing to do on a Friday afternoon. At least the people of 1949 could think about their impending doom. Industry leaders are attempting to see who can make the most realistic looking game for the sake of it, with such a large scope often being detrimental to the final product, as had been the case with games such as Cyberpunk. Sometimes so much money is poured into a game's visuals that there's a much smaller budget for most other aspects of the game's design, such as story and literal game design. This doesn't have to be the case though, as is proven time and time again with indie games. Celeste, Hollow Knight, Overkill, Enter the Gungeon, Shovel Knight, Superhot, Dead Cells, Fury, Spelunky. These games might not quite have the graphical fidelity that AAA titles boast, but make up for it with the amount of style that oozes out of every crevice, but not in a weird way. Although certain concepts such as pixel art and depression seem to see their way into more and more indie games, a majority of them are still able to differentiate themselves to a degree that just isn't quite seen with a lot of larger titles. Hollow Knight in particular was made with the intention of having characters that were easily drawn and animated in order to further expand the game into something more grand rather than drag down the overall experience with amazing visuals that do nothing to actually contribute to the game. And in spite of this, it's one of the most distinct and generally amazing looking games to just lose yourself in. The style and character seen in the indie game scene is something that I feel should really be adopted by the larger gaming industry. And while you do have exceptions such as Nintendo games and the off Psychonauts 2, the general landscape seems to have little sign of adhering to such. But this video does have a title for a reason. I wouldn't be able to publish it otherwise. But also because I do feel as though there's some instances where extreme shows of graphics are warranted. When telling a very humanistic story, there is often a merit to placing the characters in a more realistic looking world, even if such wouldn't be strictly necessary. Imagine The Last of Us, but instead of having the normal Ellie and Joel, you had the Inklings from Splatoon 2. The story itself may be gripping enough to keep your interest and allow you to feel for the characters, but eventually when Joel dies, now the impact of the scene is sullied to a certain degree due to the inability of an individual to relate to a squid person dying to their own life, somewhat surprisingly. I would say stories like The Last of Us, God of War, Metal Gear, and not Death Stranding benefit to a certain degree from the adhesion to realism desired by the developers. But not every game does. This, though, isn't to say that I think games should be either stylized or detailed with no in-between. Ratchet & Clank Rift Apart and Mario Odyssey are great examples of games that look extremely impressive and detailed visually while also being stylized. Both can exist in harmony, and any medium can evolve in the direction consumers truly desire to see with enough pushback. But the fact can't be denied that games with unnecessarily good graphics will continue to sell, and as such tell the greater industry that more should be produced in spite of consumers being aware that fidelity and quality are often exclusive. Although, perhaps there's a certain amount of comfort that comes from knowing that there'll always be another Call of Duty that looks like the last one. Always. Every time. And also Mario and Tennis.
Adam Sandler? What are you doing here?
Waiting for them to play Gangnam Style.